I'm excited to have Dr. Arash Azizi on with us today. Dr. Azizi is a historian and writer based in New York and South Carolina, a senior lecturer in history and political science at Clemson University, and the author of the upcoming What Iranians Want: Women, Life, Freedom. In light of recent events in Israel and Palestine, Fair Planet has decided to conduct an interview series on the path to peace, exploring the long-term peaceful and democratic solutions to the conflict from a diverse range of perspectives. So yeah, I wanted to start off by asking you, you've written about the unspeakable truth fairly recently. Can you explain kind of what it is and why you think people refuse to speak it and see it in your perspective?
Yeah, what I tried to write about in that article in the Newsweek was was an attempt to show something that I think it's true and close to the hearts of many people from the Middle East, but is often lost in the fog of the intractability of this conflict and of the struggle of the battle over its both sides, of the attempt to reduce everything to whether you're pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, as if you countries are football teams that you sort of support and put a jersey on, as if it's not obvious that if we want peace in this region and sort of welfare of everybody, would need to be pro both of these peoples, both Israelis and Palestinians. So the unspeakable truth for me is the fact that most people in the Middle East wake up every morning wanting to have a peaceful, prosperous, successful life, and that the wars and conflicts that engulfs their life and that is often imposed on them um, don't tell the full story of this region. That and I'm full of despair about the fact that when you mention Middle East or when you think of the Middle East, it needs to be associated with these conflicts forever. That as an Iranian writer myself, I don't want to write about the conflict. I never wanted to write a book about Qasem Soleimani, which is my first book about this Iranian general. I don't want to write about different terror groups and how they're supported by this state or not. I'd prefer much to write about our art, our culture. I want us to be in the front page of every newspaper in the world, but with the news about um, our architecture, our movies, our youth. So that's the truth for me. That uh, at the end of the day, um, the peoples of the Middle East do have a shared goal and a shared aspiration for a life free of violence, free of conflict, for a life of peace. And it's not just sort of a Pollyanna, it's not just sort of a pipe dream, as if, why don't we all get together? Is that I think if you believe that, then what you'll need to do is to have a political program that can bring that about. And a political program that would need, of course, it would need compromise, it would need pragmatism and everything else. Now, there's hardly any democracies in the Middle East. There are tons of problems. There is many Middle Eastern countries are desperately poor. Many of them have suffered from wars in the last 2 decades, and I don't pretend like there's an easy solution to all of this. But if let's just start with peace. There's this beautiful Palestinian poem which I read recently, which says, if you want me to write non-political poems, I need to listen to birds, and for me to be able to listen to birds, the bombs need to stop. I'm paraphrasing, but I really identified this poem, and I think it's very important to remember why peace is such a elementary fact. It's very easy to walk on the streets of Toronto or New York and shout the slogans like "No peace, no justice," or "We will fight to the end," or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, we need the guns to fall silent, and we need to have peace in this region. And in order to have a long term peace, we're going to need a recognition of national rights of everybody in this region, including both Israelis and the Palestinians. So that's how I get from my vision of a Middle East of peace to a practical political program that I think is very achievable. That is not some sort of a utopian dream about, generally peaceful life of the world without wars for 200 years ago, as valuable as that can be, but that in our lifetime, there's no reason why a Moshe from Ashkelon or an abbot from Gaza need to die in wars, and we can stop them. And that's what I've been trying to write about.
And in this political kind of program that you envision, what is the kind of compromises that Israel's going to have to make? And obviously you see them as being realistic compromises, but kind of what is the journey? Like, what can we expect to happen?
Israel has done a terrible thing for decades, which is that it has convinced itself that occupying another country, another people, is somehow its security pejorative. No other country in the world does this. No other country in the world occupies another place and sort of doesn't give citizenship to anyone there and says, well, I need to do this for my security. And tragically, of course, it hasn't brought it security either. So what Israel needs to do is to understand the occupation of West Bank and the siege on Gaza are not legitimate in any ways. No country in the world regards them as legitimate. Closest allies of Israel don't regard them as legitimate, and they're against any conception of decency. George Orwell has a line that people in intelligentsia sort of believe you things that no common person can, make you believe things that no common person can, and that's sort of the conversation here. And the kind of some of the Israeli defenses that you hear of this are absolutely unbelievable. For example, that all Palestinians have repeatedly rejected offers. Even if this was true, and there's some truth to it, rejected offers of what? I mean, you can't have they rejected the offer, so we're going to keep these millions of people under military subjugation until forever, which is the current policy of Israel, and crucially and unfortunately has been the policy not just of the Israeli right, but effectively of the Israeli centrists as well. And Israeli left is not politically powerful enough to be a factor really anymore, unfortunately. This needs to change, and it needs to change not because of general human rights or rights of Palestinians. It needs to change from the perspective of Israelis. It needs to change for Israel's own national interest. Does it want to be a country that is secure in its own borders? If Israel withdraws to its borders, then same rules that applies to it will apply to other states. If it needs to fight other countries in war, sometimes it would need to fight, and everything else. But it cannot hold on to millions of other people like that, or make a historic decision. If they truly want to annex West Bank and Gaza, get on with it, and then give citizenship to everybody who lives there. There no longer be a Jewish majority state, but if you want, you can do that. But what we cannot do is to continue um, holding on to these territories. And we have to remember that the obscene thing is here for a very long time. This has disappeared from Israeli sort of political agenda. None of the elections of the last since 2014 really, last round of serious, it wasn't even that serious, but last round of something of negotiations that happened in 2014, it's not even an issue. The main political issues of the country are no longer the occupation. For Israel's own interest, for its own national interest, for its own long-term security interests, it needs to bring an end to the conflict with the Palestinians, and it needs to do so by ending the occupation. In fact, as I said, it should be an Israeli political urgent issue to end the occupation, for Israel to be a normal country, right? If Israel does this, it's sort of shocking for me that it's not more commonly understood there. If Israel does this, it can be a normal country. It will be like, it won't be a perfect democracy. It won't be the best country in the world or something, but it will be a normal country with problems like other countries in the world. To me, that's a very enviable position to be in. So if then there are people around the world who march against Israel or say things, Israel can say, well, we are one more normal country like other countries. You can oppose our decisions, you can like or not like our decisions, but we are a normal country. At the moment, it is not a normal country. And it needs to use the thing that it also needs to understand is that it has a historical moment. It has, just from a political perspective, it has defeated its enemies effectively for a long time. So it can make peace still on its own terms. It won't have this opportunity forever. It is in a situation now where every Arab state in the region has accepted Israel, has recognized Israel. Most important Arab states, including its big neighbors, Jordan and Egypt, have signed peace treaties with it decades ago already. So it really has this opportunity. It won't have this opportunity forever. I don't know what gates of hell can open if this absolutely terrible war and occupation continues. But many terrible things can happen that will mean that Israel, a country that, whatever you want to say about it, has had a lot of proud achievements in its 75 years, can go to a much darker route. And for the sake of all of us in the region, including our Israeli brothers and sisters, I hope that that doesn't happen. The reality is that the Palestinian leadership, the PLO, has accepted Israel for a long time. Now they haven't always done what is necessary. I agree that they've turned down offers that they shouldn't have done. Certainly in Camp David 2000, in Taba 2001, in 2008 between Abbas and Olmert. These are fair points to make. But the fact of the matter is, for a very long time now, Israel, under the leadership of Prime Minister Netanyahu since 2009, he's been in power since 2009 almost entirely, except for 1 year. And even in that 1 year, what remained constant is that there's no movement on the Palestinian file. There's no, in fact, it's actually, not only there's no movement, there's a concerted effort to prevent the creation of the Palestinian state. The Palestinian people would have every incentive to follow their leadership in accepting Israel if it was helping to end the occupation and bringing them real material results, which are possible. And unfortunately, the lack of that is what empowers terrorist groups that are supported by the Iranian regime. Yes, the Iranian regime, in short, is an obstacle to peace, but the peace itself would be an obstacle to the growth of the influence of the Islamic Republic of Iran in Palestine and in the region as a whole.
But looking at this vision of material gains for Palestine, in terms of maybe the relocation of settlers, but in 2005 there was the evacuation of Israeli settlers from Gaza, and that was kind of maybe under 10,000. But now there are more than 700,000 settlers. How would that process happen?
I don't think you need relocation of most of the settlers. What you can do is to move the borders along a little bit. These numbers can be misleading. Yes, there are 750,000, but vast majority of these live very close to Israeli borders. So if you look at the maps like Geneva Initiative, which came out of a Palestinian-Israeli civil society negotiations, there are a lot of concrete creative proposals there. What you do is that you move the borders a little bit, and then you give some more space to Palestine along Gaza, for example. So you extend the Gaza Strip a little bit to compensate for what Palestinians will lose alongside that border. And let's say for somewhere like Ariel, which is smack in the middle of West Bank, it can continue to exist. I mean, even it would be some sort of an outpost, and a small outpost not connected to Israel, but it could there could be a corridor that takes it there, or there could be a road that takes them there. If Israel and Palestine are to accept each other and to exist alongside each other as two states, the obstacles, these would be relatively small obstacles, as I said. If there is, I think the common mistake in looking at this conflict, people, number one, have, people speak about, the two-state solution is impossible. When they say it's impossible, there's only one thing that they're actually talking about, right? They might write 6,000 word articles, but the really only thing they're talking about are the settlers in the West Bank. And I don't think this is an insurmountable problem, because, as I said, there can be a little bit of border movement, and it pales next to the enormity here, which is for both sides to accept seriously and to commit to this two-state solution. If they do that politically, these obstacles would be much easier to fight. And the Israelis often say that they have security worries, right? Well, the continuation of occupation certainly hasn't helped Israel security-wise, as you've seen. It has had to live, and it's not just the October 7 attacks. I mean, if you look at all the kind of sort of a slow burn terror attacks, and not to mention the eroding of Israel's democracy, frankly, by continuation of the settler activity in the West Bank. I mean, this doesn't bring Israel security either. Whereas if, let's say, the state of Palestine forms, of course, its military can be limited, like all militaries in the world usually have some agreements with their neighbors about how big they can be, and so then if Israel has any problem, it will have a problem with a sovereign state next door, and it's a very different situation than what it currently has to face.
But what assurances can Israel have that the acts that happened on October 7th won't happen again?
Well, like, number one, in this question can be a little confusing because, well, what assurances can Israel have that that if a state of Palestine forms, there wouldn't be attacks by a terror group? No assurances, as in, well, they happened already while the occupation was going on anyways, right? Frankly, the people of Israel are justly mad at the government for a failure to guard its borders with Gaza, which is what brought the atrocities. Now, so no, but there's no guarantee in life for anything. But there is a fact that, let's ask ourselves another question: how come these attacks didn't come from the West Bank? Because there, actually, the little bit of the Palestinian Authority that exists means that there's of course more security coordination, and it's harder for terror groups to operate out of there. But most importantly, how many situations do we have in the world of terror groups operating out of sovereign state territories against their neighbors? Not much. It does exist, right? But much less, especially not against their neighbors. And the reason for that is very simple: because a sovereign state of Palestine will have no interest in tolerating this kind of terror activities on its territory. No, this is just sort of, if you look at history, right, states generally don't have an interest in letting terror groups operate on their territory. Like, even the Islamic Republic of Iran, obviously, think about this. The Islamic Republic of Iran helps a lot of terror groups in the region, unfortunately. But does it let independent terror groups operate on its soil to attack, let's say, its neighbors like Turkey, let's say, or Iraq? Not really, right? It operates in different ways in Iraq. My point is that obviously an independent, internationally recognized sovereign state of Palestine being formed in the West Bank and Gaza will be much better for controlling terrorism in these countries. It will dry up the well of recruits for terrorism. There's a reason. Why do people go and join terror groups? They asked Ehud Barak, last prime minister of Israel, one of the former prime ministers of Israel, a while back, what would you do if you were a young Palestinian in Gaza? And he said, I would join one of the terror groups, right? Because he understood that that's the only avenue open to a lot of Palestinians. So it would dry up, it would sort of dry up that well of recruit, and it will mean that a state of Palestine is going to be bound by international relations, by its relations with Arab League. After all these Arab states, not a single one of them has fired a single shot against Israel in decades. What interest would they have in letting a sovereign state of Palestine do that? What allows terrorism to flourish and to continue is the continuation of the occupation. A sovereign state of Palestine would be a best partner. It would have an inherent interest to control its territory. After all, a statehood is nothing but sort of having a monopoly over violence, right? State of Palestine will have every interest to control its territory and to have good relations with what would be a very rich neighbor on which you would have to depend. And which is why I suggested that it is okay for the military of Palestine in this deal to be restricted,
right? Just, which is not, as I said, an unusual thing at all. It wouldn't need to have it wouldn't need to have a sort of extensive military. And let me also remind us again that Jordan is another neighbor of Israel, majority Palestinian population. How many shots Jordan has fired against Israel since it has made peace with it? And how about Egypt? These are countries with very powerful militaries, whose people, by the way, are not known to have very friendly feelings toward Israelis, frankly. However, they're bound by international conventions, and also they're not suicidal. They don't want to pick a fight all the time. So they don't attack Israel, and they don't let their territory be used for attacks on Israel.
But in this vision of this sovereign state of Palestine, you look at the destruction that is ongoing and will hopefully come to an end at some point. But whose responsibility will it be to rebuild Gaza and to help kind of implement this vision? Which other nations, in your perspective, will be involved in this rebuilding of Palestine and this creation of this sovereign state?
If the state of Palestine is able to find its sovereignty and its place, it would have no shortage of help in wanting to rebuild it. Yes, it is true that Gaza has been made inhabitable. Large parts of Gaza have effectively been made uninhabitable for months, if not years. But they can be rebuilt, like everything else. Number one, there's a massive Palestinian diaspora. We should remember that will be able to help it. And there are all the Arab countries in the region. There's all the international countries. A lot of countries in the world have a stake in wanting this conflict to come to an end, because it is a conflict that often affects them. It affects, from campuses in New York City to internal politics in Tunisia, not to mention, even those in like Chile or Brazil or Colombia. This conflict affects people. So there will be an interest to bring it down. Of course, some people also have an interest to inflame it, but a lot of people would have an interest to bring it down. And I don't think, if a state of Palestine is able to form and be sovereign, it would have no problem in attracting investment and in trying to build up. And the Arab countries can be huge there. Now, of course, the wealthy Arab countries of the Persian Gulf, like Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, they don't like to be treated as ATMs, and one shouldn't have any illusion that they'll just bank up money, but they don't need to be ATMs. They can be investors, right? They can invest. I'll guarantee you they'll compete with each other to invest in a newly founded Palestine.
But it's, I guess, the assurance that this is a long-lasting peace that they would be investing in. And so how do they begin in that period before? How would they get that assurance in order to...
This region is not exactly a peaceful region, right? And yet they've invested a lot in Iraq, despite all of its problems. They're interested in investing in Syria now. If you look at rebuilding of Syria, they've been interested in that. There is... Sorry, can you hear me? Because yes. They will be interested. They'll be interested in investing. Now, can you imagine what a huge revolution would be when this conflict, there's a sort of formal end to it, and a state of Palestine is formed and is able to control its borders, and it would have help from the other Arab countries. This would be the biggest assurance we can have for peace. With the standard of this region, is a pretty good assurance. I mean, the key thing here is to have buy-in from several states, and you will have buy-in, because you can have Turkey, you have other countries. If all the other countries are in, and if there is if there is an actual path for peace, which is what all countries want, right? If you listen to all the Arab countries, right, all of them, that's what they've signed up to at some point, and all the major ones, right? Those that are known to be a little against the two-state solution sometimes, or not joining up to it very enthusiastically, like say Iraq, which is effectively controlled by pro-Iran parties, or Algeria at some points. None of them have the sort of weight who could actually disrupt this, and the Iranian regime cannot disrupt it alone. Look, the Islamic Republic has increased its influence in this region precisely by banking on problems that exist in each of these countries. And this is the problem, unfortunately, that a lot of analysts, sort of policymakers in the West have, they don't take into consideration. If you want to fight the influence of the Islamic Republic in Yemen, you have to go through Yemen. If you want to fight it in Iraq, you have to go through Iraq to empower the Iraqi state, Iraqi institutions. It's a much more long-term plan, and less sexier, frankly, than doing a couple of military strikes on some militias that will grow again. But it's the way to go, and it's the case here as well. If there is no issue to exploit like the occupation, it would be much harder for the Islamic Republic to spread its influence.
And you also mentioned obviously the worldwide concern, but also the kind of inflammatory material that is being spread. And I wanted to ask you about TikTok activism, the role it's playing in this conflict, whether you think there should be potentially more censorship on inflammatory kind of videos, comments that potentially quite uninformed people are making around the conflict.
So let me start from the from the last part of your question. I'm not pro censorship, generally speaking, although content moderation, it's a specific sort of process that exists anyways. So it's a question of what should be the contours of this content moderation and how should it work. But surely we can all agree it shouldn't be there to block uninformed takes, because that's not the world we want to live in. We don't want some board, like 6 people sit somewhere and decide what is uninformed and what is informed and then block it. That's not what we want, right? Now, what counts as incitement? What counts as, let's say outright hatred of some forms that can be moderated, or sort of graphic imagery, that depends on the platform. It's sort of a tough call often, but I'm definitely, I'm a freedom of speech guy, so I definitely err on the other side always. I also don't think it's an effective way of fighting misinformation to just censor it, because you have this media. What are you going to do about WhatsApp? Are you going to sort of, people will always exchange messages with each other, and a lot of it, and there's tons of misinformation and disinformation there, and there are scholars who sort of work on this. But on the content of the matter, unfortunately, yes, this conflict does give itself to a lot of uninformed is a polite way of putting it. I mean, it's sort of outright batshit crazy takes that go on a lot of platforms. TikTok is particularly known for it. I mean, I think it raises a lot of questions, unfortunately, about our public culture. And we have all been sleepwalking into this situation. I think a lot of sections of media have played a very shameful role. All those major media outlets that have helped this TikTokification, people don't read newspapers as much anymore, of course. People, in fact, don't read as much anymore. And this reliance on sensory information of images, of sounds, those who were concerned about this, the Frankfurt School old guys from the 1960s were warning about this. And now we see it's height, right? That for tons of people, there is no reading sort of informed text, and there is only listening to these videos that are made not only with no knowledge of the conflict, but in sort of this sensationalist way. And I think it's terrible.
Yeah, and I also wondered, as a kind of professor, your role in, I mean, certainly I'm based in a university context at the moment, and because it is such a heightened kind of dialogue that is going on, heightened by TikTokification and other elements, that a fear of kind of, when you're having or attempting to have a kind of constructive dialogue around peace and around the war, that by not fully condemning Israel or not fully condemning kind of Palestine, you will kind of be boxed into a certain category. I guess it comes back to this binary narrative that is kind of being reinforced, and how you have kind of approached that with students.
Peace is always going to be hard work, and because it's easier to, binary narratives are easier. People like good and evil, good guys and bad guys. And unfortunately, a lot of academics who should be against this haven't had to inflame this and helped it. Frankly, you know, because they are also interested in a Marvel Cinematic Universe version of the world in which there are good guys and there are bad guys. Although this is a bit of an insult to superhero films, some of whom are actually more nuanced in their understanding and you know than some academics, frankly. So what can be done to fight against that? Well, I try in teaching politics of the Middle East in all sort of work that I do, and I'm not alone, and tons of others, to try to give an empathic understanding that, look, these are people, they're human beings on both sides, they have legitimate demands, and no, legitimate demands on, some of them are legitimate, they also have a lot of demands that are illegitimate, frankly. And the point is that there is a way for them to, after all, as we say, share this land. And we need to point to it. But I have to say, censorious attitudes also don't help here, and there are censorious attitudes on both sides in a way. But of course, a lot of it has happened on those who call themselves proponents of Israel, who have helped shut down a lot of a speech in one way or the other, and I don't find that helpful at all. In fact, it's poisonous. It really helps the extremists, right? They love to be banned, right? If you're extremist, there's nothing that satisfies you as much as being banned. So then you can be this banned hero and martyr that is not allowed to. And also what it means for ordinary people, for people who don't have a sort of a strong feeling for one side or the other, is that they're just afraid. They're afraid of talking about this. They're afraid of thinking about it. And they are the voices who will be pushed back. And I think that's a serious problem. But we should also remember that at the end of the day, what people will say in these campuses and TikToks need not matter also as much. There is a lot of, unfortunately, this conflict brings people out in this way like nothing else does. And I really say unfortunately, because I mean it. I think it's good when people show sympathy for Palestinian people who are being killed in Gaza. I think that's a good thing, obviously. What is not a good thing, however, is that they sort of take over. They sort of take over the discourse on this conflict, so that it cannot be a normal one, and that they're crazy maximalist visions that have nothing to do with reality will take over. And the difference is, of course, when you're a 22-year-old, a student from Massachusetts, you can want Israel to be destroyed. You can want anything that you can say anything that you want because you're in Massachusetts. You're not gonna die for it, and you probably graduate and become a lawyer in 2 years anyways. Other people have to pay for it for their lives. So this is the very unhelpful reality in our lives, is that it's the kind of advocacy that people do is not commensurate with their skin in the game, right? Let's say when there's an election in the UK or the US, we can hate each other for the kind of choices that we make, but we have to pay for it, right? You live in the UK, you vote for the Conservatives or Labour, or you don't, or you vote for the Green, right? But you have to pay for it. Whereas in this case, people who make these positions don't have to pay for it because they live somewhere else. And I think that's a major problem, and I think that's a major problem for Palestinians. It's also a major problem for Israelis, by the way, because the other thing is all the sort of outlandish supporters of Israel's right-wing government, in Las Vegas and in other parts of the US, they also don't have to, they don't have to live in Israel, right? They at most travel there on a nice tourist vacation every couple of years, or maybe if they're rich, they'll buy an apartment in Jerusalem that they'll use once in a while. But the actual people of Israel, the diverse peoples of Israel, have to live there, right? They have to have daily lives there, and and they don't deserve for their country's cause to be hijacked effectively by some pressure groups in the US.
And finally, on a more specific point of recent events that we've seen today, should we be optimistic about the recent hostage deal and the ceasefire that's hopefully will commence on Thursday? Is this any kind of indication towards the end of the conflict, or could we take any form of optimism from it or not?
It's hard to be optimistic. I mean, I'm obviously happy that many hostages are being released and that there would be a cease in fighting for a few days. But ultimately, what we need, of course, is a planning for the day after in Gaza, whenever this day after is. And there have been some proposals of restoration of Palestinian Authority to Gaza, of the buying of the sort of Arab countries, of bringing some sort of a Arab peacekeeping force, a lot of which unfortunately don't have a lot of support, including from a lot of Arab countries. And of course, Israel continues to have a far-right government, including alt-right fascists, who are interested openly in ethnic cleansing of Gaza, and who have no intention of wanting to end the conflict. But if there's something that makes me hopeful, is that the peoples of this region, including the people of Israel, who, as I said, I think ultimately do want peace. And I think it is possible to imagine that at the end of this gruesome current round of the conflict, they will be able to elect a different government in Israel, one that understands finally that it has no interest in continuing the occupation, and that it will prioritize ending this conflict. And that on the Palestinian side, they will also be met with partners who understand that there is the only path forward is recognition of Israel, and recognizing that these people are there and they have to share this land together. And Arab countries around the region, who have, a lot of them have already warmed up to Israel and will be ready to be part of the solution. So that's what gives me hope. I think ultimately the path to peace lies in that recognition. And I do think it's possible, even if not in the very short term.
Thank you so much, Arash. It was such a pleasure to speak to you today.